So there's a lot of cellular biology involved with this. Some of these things, for people who like to really delve deep into this, I'll give you some key names here that you can look up. There are the effects of fasting, and fasting by itself can promote the increase of something called sirtuins. Now, without getting too much into the weeds, sirtuins have been involved with and have been associated with longevity, have been associated with something called health span, where you're living longer and healthier, and really all very good things in terms of sirtuins. It also blocks the increase in insulin. Now, insulin is one of those, and insulin-like growth factors are one of those things that increases weight, it increases lipids, and reactive oxygen species. So these are the things that you sort of don't want to have. Fasting blocks that. And then there's these two players, okay? Something called AMPK and mTOR. And as we talked about with the city, in terms of, is it time to build or is it time to repair? These are the major deciders of what's going to be going on in the body. So when you are eating, mTOR is activated. But as it shows here on the slide, when you're fasting, something called AMPK is activated, and this will have downstream effects, and mTOR is inhibited. So this timing is everything again, as we talked about. So by fasting, you have an increase and improvement in AMPK, a reduction in mTOR, which has a sort of a double effect on something called the ULK complex. The ULK complex is very important in starting this thing called autophagy or autophagy, literally from the Latin meaning self-eating. It sounds bad, but it's actually very good. You've got these damaged proteins in your body that need to be repaired. What's going to do it? Autophagy is going to do it. And so, again, trying to make sure you understand that intermittent fasting is not just some gimmick where you reduce your calories and you lose weight and that's the end goal. There's actually not just the quantity aspect of your body, there's the quality aspect of your body. I really can't emphasize that enough, is that the proteins that are supposed to be doing things in your body are higher quality. They have less damage to them. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. So these things are associated with the inhibition of aging, cancer, diabetes, obesity, Alzheimer's disease, repair in the brain, and also anti-aging with the ULK complex and the AMPK, immunity. Autophagy has to do with antigen presentation. It has to do with a good immune system, and it's required to produce antibodies. So all of these things are very, very important, especially when you're dealing with infections, COVID-19, these sorts of things. So again, intermittent fasting, really important. But I don't want to tie this to just COVID-19 because we've known about these effects for a long time. There was a very important paper that was published out of the University of Southern California where oncologists were looking at their patients who they were giving chemotherapy to. And what they noticed is that when their patients fasted for up to 72 hours, there was a complete remaking of their immune system. One of the authors in the study actually said it was as if their immune system had been completely recreated. It was a very stunning statement. This paper that was published back then showed that prolonged fasting downregulated the insulin growth factor type 1 signaling pathway and also a number of other pathways called PKA. And this was related to the stem cells, which are responsible for your immune system. And this prolonged fasting protected these blood cells that were made in the bone marrow from the effects of the chemotherapy. In fact, in the study, it showed that if they did intermittent fasting for 72 hours, but not just 24, but 3 days, in other words, they were able to maintain their white blood cell count, even in the light of chemotherapy. Now, normally when you give chemotherapy to patients, their white blood cell counts go down as a result of the chemotherapy. Trust me, I know this as a pulmonary and critical care specialist who takes care of patients who come in because they have infections, because their white blood cell counts are low. So just by intermittent fasting for 72 hours, they were able to completely ameliorate or get rid of that drop in the white blood cell count associated with chemotherapy. And that's just amazing. So now what they do when they have their patients come in for chemotherapy is they have them fast for 72 hours prior to chemotherapy so they can reduce the incidence of infections. So just imagine what we could do to an immune system that wasn't going to be affected by chemotherapy. So these types of effects of intermittent fasting have been known for some period of time. One of the things that's really interesting is its effect on fat, actually. There's two types of fat. There is regular, or what we call white fat, and then there is brown fat. Now, the nice thing about brown fat is that there is energy being produced, but only for the purpose of heat. So this is almost like a short circuiting in a good way, because what this does is it elevates your basal metabolic rate. And it's much easier to lose weight when you have a higher basal metabolic rate. Well, one of the things that you can do to convert white fat into brown fat is intermittent fasting, as was published in this paper back in 2017. It showed that intermittent fasting states turned white fat into brown fat, as does cold exposure, as we'll talk about again, and it increases the metabolic rate, as we've discussed. So intermittent fasting also reduces the incidence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. This is where fatty streaks are placed inside of the liver and a lot of other organs as well. This is bad fat, what we call visceral fat. And this fatty inflammation could cause liver dysfunction. We see patients with elevated liver enzymes in this situation, and it's associated with obesity. Well, intermittent fasting reduces this. It also has been shown to improve the population of good beneficial bacteria in the colon. And so intermittent fasting has some multiple effects that are all very good. Now, what about people who are obese? What about people who have diabetes? So let's get down to brass tacks. What can it do for you or somebody who has diabetes or maybe wants to avoid having diabetes? I think that's just about everybody here on the planet. There was a paper that was published, a very interesting paper, titled Time-Restricted Feeding Improves Blood, Glucose, and Insulin Sensitivity in Overweight Patients with type 2 diabetes. And this was a randomized controlled trial. Now, folks, this is the highest level of evidence that we have in science. When you do a randomized controlled trial, this eliminates a lot of bias. So the information in this paper is going to be very important, and it's going to be very reliable. So what they did was they took 120 overweight diabetics that were type 2 diabetics. This was done in China. And they randomized them into equal groups. In the intervention group, they said, okay, you've got 10 hours in a day to do all the eating that you want to do. And they actually didn't even restrict them to how much they ate or even what they ate. They just said, here is 10 hours that you have to eat. And in the control group, they said, you can eat whenever you want, whatever you want, how much you want. And they did this study for 12 weeks. And they looked at a number of aspects of them. So obviously they were diabetic, and so they looked at hemoglobin A1C, and they looked at what their fasting blood sugars were. And they looked at a number of other things as well to see what would happen in these people. So remember now that they've restricted their time to eat. So for instance, they could start to eat at 8 o'clock in the morning, and then they would have to stop 10 hours later, so around 6 o'clock. So let's see what happened here in terms of the results. So here we see the clock time here at the top, and we have something, the TRF, which is the time restricted feeding. I like to use the term time restricted eating. It's the same situation. There was a fasting period that ended at 8 o'clock in the morning, and from 8 o'clock until 6 o'clock in the evening, they were able to eat whatever they wanted, how much they wanted, but they had to stop eating at 6 o'clock in the evening, and then they had a fasting period after that. The control group, as we mentioned, they could eat how much they wanted whenever they wanted. So what's interesting about this is that just by implementing this and not even telling them what to eat, there was about a 28% reduction in calories in the time-restricted eating group. But it wasn't like it was implemented on them. This is something that they did on their own as a result of just limiting the time. So what happened to hemoglobin A1C? Hemoglobin A1C is a sort of an average blood sugar over the last 3 months of an individual. It's very well coordinated and correlated to how many complications that people have from diabetes. And so it's a very good universal measure of how well someone's diabetes is under control or not. And what they noticed is that there was a 8% reduction in hemoglobin A1C in the control group, but an 18% reduction in hemoglobin A1C in just 12 weeks by implementing this type of a dietary standard. And that was statistically significant. Folks, let me just give you a little bit of insight into this. That's a huge amount of reduction in hemoglobin A1C. If you were to see how much a diabetic medication reduces hemoglobin A1C, it's on the order of about maybe 7%. You're seeing here 18% reduction and a full 10% over the baseline that was seen in the control group. So that's very significant. And of course, it was statistically significant as well. It's very, very possible that there could have been some people in this group who were maybe on one blood pressure medication or maybe were pre-diabetic or close to it, that were able to completely come off their medications. Something, of course, that I wouldn't recommend doing unless you have consultation with your physician. But just by implementing this time-restricted eating agenda, you could have some major, major effects in just 12 weeks. What about fasting glucose? We measure that with the control group, and there was a 14 milligram per deciliter reduction. In the time-restricted eating group, a full 26 milligrams per deciliter. Let me put that into perspective. Diabetes is defined as a blood glucose of 126 milligrams per deciliter or more. A definition of prediabetes is at 100. On average, there was a 26-point reduction. That's like going from 126 down to 100. That's a very, very large reduction in average fasting blood sugar. Okay, what about weight? Everybody is concerned about weight, which I understand is reasonable, but remember here, we're not just looking at quantity. We're not just looking at pounds. We're looking at the quality of what you've got in your body. And as we've already said, time-restricted eating not only can drop weight, can drop calories, but also improve the quality of what's going on in your body. Nevertheless, people are interested in weight, and as we can see here, that the average weight loss in this group that just restricted the time to a certain time of day lost 6.6 pounds. And in the control group, it was 1.8, and that was statistically significant. So here is a randomized control trial done in patients with diabetes, and all they had to do was restrict their eating time. And we can see a very, very important and statistically significant benefit. But it doesn't just end there. As opposed to a lot of the medications that I prescribe for my patients in the clinic, which have side effects that I have to be very careful of, time-restricted eating has side benefits, not side effects. And so if we look at the metabolic health, there was a study that was done showing that there was a reduction in visceral fat, fasting insulin, insulin resistance. In terms of fasting on physical exercise, there was a reduction in fat, but no reduction in muscle mass. So again, very beneficial. Nobody wants to lose muscle mass. That's important. This was mind-blowing. In people who had breast cancer, okay, they already have a diagnosis of breast cancer. If those patients who already had breast cancer and were worried about a recurrence, if they fasted for less than 13 hours per night, that was associated with a 30% increase risk of breast cancer coming back. So if you've got breast cancer and you want to prevent yourself from getting a recurrence of the breast cancer, of course you do, it would be important to make sure that you're fasting at least 13, 14, 15 hours a day. And that would mean restricting your eating time to 10 hours. What about hormones? 3 days into a fast, so a 72-hour fast in this case, improved growth hormone level, which is associated with deep sleep or slow wave sleep. There was a 3-fold increase in growth hormone. For many years, people consider growth hormone the holy grail of longevity or feeling young. It was the fountain of youth. And then, of course, as we've talked about, the gut microbiome was improved with fasting into a much healthier population. So, have I convinced you? Are you ready to do time-restricted eating? Is it something that you're willing to do? It's probably one of the lowest hanging fruits on the tree that you can do. I haven't talked to you about what you're eating. I haven't talked to you about how much you're eating. All I'm telling you to do, and we could talk a lot about that, by the way. There's a lot of stuff you could be gained to by modifying your diet and cutting down on the amount of calories. But I'm not even talking about that today. All I'm talking about is just saying, let's restrict the time of eating to a certain period of the day. So how would you do that? What are some goalposts here or guidelines in terms of how to implement time-restricted eating. So the first thing we have to do is define sleep. And remember, you want at least 7 to 9 hours of sleep per night. And why do we do that? It's because during sleep is when you're fasting, and you're already fasting. So what you want to do is build and extend that period of time out. So the first thing I would do is extend that time by 1 hour in the morning. In other words, that you get up in the morning, let's say you get up at 6 o'clock in the morning, don't eat until 7. So that'll extend that for another hour. And then even more important than that, I believe, is not eating anything 3 to 4 hours before you go to bed. And there's many reasons for this. One of the reasons is that you don't really reach your fasting state until about 4 to 5 hours after you put the last morsel of food into your body. Remember, that food is still in your esophagus, your stomach, your intestine. Your body is still in the fed state. And so it's important that your body transitions from the fed state to the fasted state as you're going to bed. Now, there's many ways of speeding that up. One way of speeding that up is to actually exercise. I don't recommend exercising at night over exercising in the morning. I think it's better to exercise in the morning. But if you can't exercise in the morning, exercising at night is better than not exercising at all. And we talk more about exercising in that video as well. But you would not believe how many patients I see in the clinic that have gastroesophageal reflux disease or heartburn. And the reason for this is because they're eating too close to bedtime. They're lying down, they have food in their stomach, and that food refluxes up the esophagus. It causes them heartburn. Folks, it's much better not to have anything in your stomach 3 to 4 hours before you lie down. And it's for multiple reasons. As I just mentioned, for gastroesophageal reflux, but also very importantly in intermittent fasting to extend that fast time. So again, pick your 7 to 9 hours of sleep, extend before it for about 3 to 4 hours, and after it for about an hour. And then from there, we can work in terms of where we want to go. So what you'll find when you do this is that when you start to compress the time period in which you're eating, you're going to have to figure out and make a decision at some point. Is it breakfast that I skip to try to compress it, or is it dinner that I skip? And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I can tell you this, that initially when I started to do intermittent fasting, because as soon as I read the results of these studies, I immediately implemented it in my own life, realizing that the benefits were just so good to let this go. Because of my schedule as a physician, and because I rarely get to see my family in the morning, I usually see them at night, and because eating is such a social time, I chose to forego breakfast and to have lunch and then make sure that my calories were early enough in the evening that I could be with them and talk with them and eat with them, but then have enough time before I actually went to bed and hopefully still get my 7 hours of sleep. So you've got to sort of calculate all of this. Remember what we said at the very beginning when we showed that circadian rhythm. It's not all the same to your circadian rhythm. There is data which suggests that your insulin is more sensitive in the morning. And as a result of that, it may be more beneficial to not skip breakfast, but maybe skip dinner. But the differences is I would hate for people not to do this because they would rather skip breakfast rather than skipping dinner. The point is that I think you ought to do one versus the other, and I think one or the other is better than not doing this at all. But to actually put some data behind this, let's look at a study that was done specifically looking at what would happen if we scrunched together this eating time and allowed time-restricted eating to occur. The way they did this particular study is they decided not to skip breakfast, but to move dinner earlier in the day. So as you can see here, we've got the clock time. This paper was published, and it's the name of this article is Early Time-Restricted Feeding Improves 24-Hour Glucose Levels and Affects Markers of the Circadian Clock, Aging, and Autophagy in Humans. So this was a very powerful study because they took 11 overweight adults, and you think 11 is not that much, but actually it was a crossover study. So in other words, the subjects were their own controls. That's a very statistically significantly powerful way of doing a trial. And what they did, as you can see, is in that top line, they had the regular type of meals. They had 33% of the calories at breakfast, which is around 8 o'clock in the morning. They had 33% of the meals at lunchtime, which is around 2 o'clock in the afternoon. And then here's this 8 o'clock at night dinner. This is something that I often used to partake in because I would get off my shift at 7 o'clock at night from the hospital. I'd come home, there'd be a nice big dinner for me, and I would talk with my family. So I used to live as that control. And what did they do to compare it? Well, they just took it, and as you can see, they scrunched it together so that breakfast, now same calories, is still at 8 o'clock in the morning, but lunch, instead of being at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, is now at 11 o'clock in the morning. And dinner, which again, same number of calories, that didn't change, instead of it being at 8 o'clock at night, look, it's actually at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So after 2 o'clock, the last morsel of food goes in, goes down the esophagus, goes into the stomach, and there's about a 4 to 5 hour period of time where the body is transitioning into the fasted state. And what we have here is 18 hours until the next meal. 18 hours is certainly going to fulfill the requirements for the 13-hour fast to reduce breast cancer, 33%. And what they did here is that they monitored continuous glucose monitoring, they measured PM draws, AM draws, and they wanted to look at a number of different outcomes. Now let me show you what they found after they did this, just for 4 days. Just 4 days, okay? Amazing stuff. First thing I want to look at are the genes that regulate your circadian rhythm. Okay, this looks like a mess here, but I want to explain it to you. Each one of these entities, BMAL1, clock, PER1, PER2, CRY1, CRY2, these are all proteins that are involved in the regulation of your circadian rhythm. Now, each one of these has 4 bars on it. The first 2 bars have to do with what's going on in the morning, and the second 2 bars has to do with what's going on in the evening. And what they're measuring here is the amount of transcription of these proteins. And those little funny symbols above it, the little stars, has to do with if there was a statistically significant difference between the transcription of those. And notice that in almost all of these cases, when they did the time-restricted feeding, which is the darker of the 2 bars, okay? Notice that in almost every case, it was higher. There was more transcription. There was, in other words, better regulation of the circadian rhythm. The only exception to that was in PER1 or PER1. This is one of the products of the circadian rhythm. This is one of the proteins, and it's specifically usually emphasized in the morning and not so much in the evening. Now, if you notice there, when you went from the control to the time-restricted eating, there was more of an exaggerated difference between those 2 levels. In other words, the white was sort of high in the morning and sort of low in the evening, but notice when they went to time-restricted eating on PER1 that there was a really high expression of the gene in the morning and a lower expression of the gene in the evening, meaning there was more definitive regulation of the circadian rhythm. So in other words, the circadian rhythm may dictate when we do our time-restricted eating, but time-restricted eating actually back feeds into the circadian rhythm and demonstrates that the circadian rhythm is actually more definitive. So there's a sort of a two-way communication. Light affects the circadian rhythm, but I also want to show you here that food also affects the circadian rhythm. And when you scrunch together those feeding times, that's going to make it more definitive for your body to be on regulation in terms of your circadian rhythm. Okay, so that we just showed that time-restricted eating improves your circadian rhythm, but what else does time-restricted eating do? Here are some more results from the very same study. They found that there was improved glycemic control, and it lowered 24-hour glucose levels, that it reduced the ups and downs of glycemia. What happens when you have ups and downs? That means you're getting more insulin, less insulin, more insulin, less insulin. That has to put these things. When you put the meals together closer, it's smoother. It goes up for a period of time, and then it goes down, and it can stay down. Notice in the graph to the right labeled cortisol that when you combined all of your consumption of calories to one portion of the day, that the cortisol levels were higher in the morning and lower in the evening. So in other words, cortisol boost in the morning was much higher, presumably because the circadian rhythm was more on track. which is exactly when you need cortisol levels in the morning to do the stress of the day. But as you're retiring for the evening, because you've moved that meal from 8 o'clock in the morning to 2 o'clock in the afternoon, guess what? Cortisol levels are lower. It's easier to go to sleep. But if you're thinking about just sleep, it's not just that, it's more, because there's actually the brain that's involved. So there's an enzyme called the BDNF, which stands for brain-derived neurotrophic factor. These are the factors that actually nourish your neurons and keep them nourished and doing what they need to do. Notice what happened in the BDNF graph to the right. You can see there that the time-restricted eating, which is the dark bars, are higher than the white bars, which are the control. Again, so what we're seeing here is when we compress the time of day that we're eating to 8 to 10 hours, we're getting not only better cortisol levels, higher in the morning, less in the evening, but we're also getting better BDNF expression that's going to be improving cognition and things of that nature. We talked about sirtuins. Sirtuins are those things that are connected to longevity. It's a complicated substance, and it's involved in a lot of things, and it goes beyond the scope of this talk. But just know that it promotes insulin secretion and action. It upregulates fat metabolism, protects against inflammation, oxidative stress, and DNA damage, and increases telomere stability and extends lifespan. Telomeres are the little things that get put on the end of DNA so that when it replicates, there's a little bit left there, so when the DNA replicates, it could replicate the entire molecule without chopping off parts of it at the end. So telomeres are very good. They're involved in lifespan. Notice what happened here with the sirtuin ones. They actually went up as well in time-restricted eating. And finally, LC3A encodes this essential structural component of autophagosomal membranes. So we talked about autophagy. Autophagy has been shown to play a major role in protecting against multiple chronic diseases such as diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and neurodegenerative diseases by recycling damaged and used proteins in organelles. So again, we know that fasting is going to increase NMPK, it's going to increase the ULK1 complex, and it's going to increase autophagy. And all of these things are happening at the same time.